Great, thank you so much. And the structure of this panel will be fairly simple. It'll start with a discussion among the panelists, and then it'll open up to Q&A. Our panel of experts represents a variety of perspectives, not just about the war in Afghanistan, but also about the conservative stance on war and nation building more generally. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I am not a conservative. However, because I examine U.S. foreign policy from a classical liberal perspective, I do sympathize with the modern, or at least the traditional conservative notions that have a sort of an aversion to America's military impulse. And as you'll hear shortly, I think some on the panel actually share that view. Now, because we have distributed full biographies of all the panelists to the conference attendees, I will just offer a brief introduction and then get started with our discussion. From your left to right, we have Tony Blankley, columnist with the Washington Times, now Executive Vice President for Edelman Public Relations. Don Devine, editor of conservative Battleline and former director of the Office of Personnel Management. Mackenzie Eaglen, research fellow for national security studies at the Heritage Foundation and policy expert on military budgeting and strategic planning. And Diana West, nationally syndicated columnist and regular contributor to the Washington Examiner. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, all of you, for being here. So let us just turn to the first question. We'll just go down the row. So panel, the United States has been in Afghanistan for a little over 8 years. Given that country's widespread corruption, pervasive poverty and illiteracy, and the dysfunction of the international alliance, what, for you, constitutes success? And what price should we be willing to pay for it?
Well, I come to Afghanistan on a specifically distinctive basis. I look at who our commander-in-chief is, and I do not have confidence in his intention to pursue success. So although I'm normally supportive of engaging in using whatever we need to, somewhere in the zone of Dana Robark's views, although a little different, I believe in engagement, and I think we have interests to protect there, but I don't believe that the resources are going to be applied. I think he said he wants to get out in 18 months, and I don't want to see any of our troops killed to cover a politician's backside. Mm-hmm. So that's a different question than, given the commander-in-chief we're going to have for at least another 3 years, my choice would be probably the Biden solution, which is to disengage as quickly as we can with maintaining some minimal supportive presence, because I can't ask anyone to die for an exit strategy. Mm-hmm.
Success was leaving 3 or 4 years ago. What do you do now? What Tony says is the only possible thing. I mean, you've got to turn it over to the local, and that's been the whole problem there. They can't decide. You're going to have central government control. You're going to turn it over to the community. They're still arguing it this week. But they've got to make a decision one way or the other, and I think the only way we're going to get out is if we let the local forces take it over. There's no way you can run that country centrally out of Kabul. Nobody's ever been able to do it. Nobody ever will.
I believe success is an Afghanistan that can defend itself, purely and simple, but it is not necessarily the elimination of all violence in the country. I fall in the sort of general U.S. military camp here where diminishing violence levels and, of course, decreasing the insurgency and the influence of the Taliban is important. But it would be unrealistic for the U.S. to expect that we could ever see this wholly peaceful, flowering, prosperous nation, and I don't think that is our goal. Again, an Afghanistan that could defend itself, and for all of the requisite reasons therein for what our interests in that are, is, I think, a modest and reasonable and achievable goal.
I would say before we discuss what success in Afghanistan would look like, there's a need to assess whether success in Afghanistan is in our national security interest. I think that the question implies that there is something for us to win in Afghanistan, and I'm firmly of the belief that there is not, that Afghanistan is really on the wrong side of our line in the sand if we are going to draw one in this period of resurgent jihad, which has not been mentioned in the question. That's also a big problem in Afghanistan. And there needs to be a real reassessment of American goals and interests.
I think, absolutely.
Let me just respond, because the purpose has shifted. I mean, initially, after 9/11, the purpose was essentially a punitive incursion to punish the regime that hit us. And I can't imagine that we wouldn't have done that. And we did that. We kicked the regime out. Then we stayed. And now the question is, what interest do we have? And we have, unfortunately, two different interests that I don't think we're capable under the current regime here in Washington of vindicating. But one is that if we turn tail and run, and I'm agreeing we sort of have to because of our current regime here, but we are going to pay a price because it'll be claimed as a triumph by jihadis. At first they kicked out the Soviets and then they kicked out the Americans. It will add to recruiting and increase the radical Islamic threat to us I think that's a price we're going to have to pay because I don't think our current government's going to do anything useful. And then the other piece is that with the question of Pakistan degrading as a governing entity, do we have some new function there to be supportive, which Afghanistan is only a side to that issue. But I don't think that we're bringing the resources to bear on that, and I think there are other solutions. So I think we do pay a price for leaving. They're not the prices that the things we were seeking to accomplish when we got there.
I think that's true.
One thing, I don't think the regime is the problem. I don't. I think the last regime was the problem. This guy's just picking up, as Rohrabacher said. I mean, the problem, and Bush kept the troop level down there, which he kept them halfway in between.
Right.
I mean, he just left us with neither option. But I'd like to ask Mackenzie, what do you mean by security of Afghanistan?
In what sense?
You said that's
itself or just
what does that mean? Does it mean the Kabul is running the country? I mean, what does it mean that Afghanistan is running itself, or whatever term you use?
that it's capable of defending itself.
Defending from whom? Nobody's attacking Afghanistan.
Even from internal threats, which are these days are just part and parcel with the threats emanating from the region. Everything has bled over so much, somewhat to Tony's point, including into Pakistan as well as other regional. Al-Qaeda is a globally inspired insurgency. So it's certainly leadership is in the region, in the Fatah, in Pakistan as well. They've linked up with the Taliban, but it's not exclusive to Afghanistan. So a country that can defend itself certainly requires some elements of governance and reconstruction. The governance pieces are certainly debatable. I don't know that a strong central government is necessarily achievable in a realistic time frame. But then again, in a tribal nation like Afghanistan, I traveled there 2 years ago. What we've seen, for example, in specific regions and areas is that success on a village or mountain basis or community basis is achievable. And if you put the Afghan National Security Forces, various elements therein, including Border Patrol, in charge of this, and they're in charge of basically defeating 4 of the threats that Afghanistan does face today right now, not the U.S. or coalition forces, although we're certainly a partner in that effort, then they can help do things like achieve local security, root out corruption.
Who? The National Army? Who is doing all this?
The Army, the police force, the Border Patrol. And then
the problem is the Army and the local militias are fighting each other.
Some places.
And Afghanistan lives to fight each other. If you did what I think is the ideal, which is decentralizing it, you're not going to have peace. They're all going to be fighting with each other. You know, it may not be big bombs in the air, but they're going to be fighting each other. So it seems to me peace within Afghanistan cannot be the goal.
Well, I didn't say that. I said a reduction in the level of hostility, but not an elimination of it.
Well, Mackenzie and Don, Diana actually brings up this good point in the sense that what discernible U.S. interest does the United States have in sort of trying to settle disputes amongst different tribes in Afghanistan? I mean,
well, I would say none, but I would say that does not mean there is not an overriding U.S. interest in the region, which is the Pakistani nuclear capability. And if America does not have a program, a plan to completely neutralize that capability as needed, then we are truly in trouble. But in terms of making peace among various tribes. We have seen this already falling apart. I mean, it would be funny. It would be Keystone Cop time if it weren't so tragic. We saw just this past week a tribal agreement of 400,000.
Oh, the Shinwari tribe.
Yes, they fell apart because they started fighting again. But you wonder what happened to the $1 million that was supposed to have kept the tribal elders keeping hold of the 400,000 tribal members. I mean, that, down the drain again. This is just one small instance. But no, there is no overriding American interest in making peace among tribes in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not an overriding American interest. The Pakistani nukes, that is our overriding interest in that area. And as far as Tony's point about suffering for a retreat, I would say it depends how that retreat is couched, how that retreat is prepared. It is not to say that threats may not come from Afghanistan or come from the same region. They can be addressed in ways that does not require the logistical nightmare of basing hundreds of thousands of Americans and allied forces in Afghanistan, which of course is a nightmare as a landlocked country. We're seeing that as a big problem, getting the new troops that the president's ordered going in. The theory that has not been tested, the theory that makes the most sense to me, is something often known in military parlance as the lily pad strategy, which is essentially basing American firepower either in friendly bases already existing in friendly nations or off-carrier groups, which can command as much firepower as some nations put together, their military resources. So if you stay on essentially an offensive stance and say, not taking attacks, further attacks, not taking further aggressions as they affect us, then I don't think you are going to be perceived as retreating. You're going to be perceived as being, smart, no longer feeding in.
I mean, people can smell a retreat. And if we're taking a powder, we're taking a powder. And we ought to understand that that jihadis around the world are going to sense they won and we lost on this round. I mean,
I would say
we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking. And when we stand off, and maybe we have to do, I say that may be the default position we got to go to. But the problem is if you don't have intelligence in country, then you're just sitting there and you end up sort of being isolated little units you have to defend, wherever it is. And you spend a lot of money and time defending your force and you don't have much effect in country. So the truth is, it's not much of a strategy to sit off in little enclaves and pretend that you're having an impact in a country. The reality is that there's been this absurd mission creep in Afghanistan from the initial cause, which was obvious, to now we're sort of stuck there and trying to figure out. And I think it's a loss either way. Either we stay and we lose men, or we leave and we lose face. And there's a price to pay for losing face. But I'd rather at this point lose face than men. I mean that's
right. I mean I think that overall, the notion that we'll look weak when we do withdraw or when we do scale down our presence, I do think that's legitimate. I do sympathize with that notion. However, I think people who do make that argument, they sort of vastly oversimplify the fact that we do look weak the longer we stay, and the fact that our military does appear bogged down, our mission and our strategy appears aimless. We are also feeding recruits to the indigenous Pakistani Taliban on the opposite side of the border that's destabilizing Pakistan. So I guess a more pointed question I should have asked is, what for you constitutes failure? And when should policymakers essentially come to the conclusion that, despite all of our efforts, that really this mission is just not working?
Yeah, this mission is on the brink of failure, and it will fail, I think. As Dana said in the previous one, when Reagan recognized that the Beirut mission was a failure and he cut his losses. You don't like to admit failure, but look, I understand that when McChrystal's memo to the president, before the president made his decision, that the language, as it's been described to me in the uncleansed version, was that if we're fully resourced, men and materiel, and if the U.S. government in all its different branches coordinates much better than it has been, then in 5 to 7 years, we have a better than even chance of succeeding at establishing a government that will be able to assert its sovereignty in most of the country. That was the best case scenario that McChrystal gave to the president. Better than even. That's basically a crapshoot. If we have more resources and men and do better than we're likely to be able to do over a longer period of time than the president or probably the Americans want to give to it. So it's very hard to see success happen even with a better strategy and more resources. Because McChrystal was pretty brutal. Better than even is not much for the generals. Usually they say, if you give us this, we'll get the job done. They didn't say that this time. They said better than even, which is like the lowest level of justification for doing anything.
If you look at the one that the newspapers got a hold of.
Yeah, that was.
I mean, you don't need any more than that. Yeah. I mean, it was realistic, the problems, and he gives very little hope for success, even if he gets what he wants.
I mean, that's the point. I mean, that was a very discouraging document.
It was an incredible thing. I mean, when I read that, you understand what the problem was. And the military understands this and has understood it from the beginning. You know, there's this left-wing nonsense of blaming the military for wanting to get it. It's just nonsense. They didn't want to get in. They were reluctant to it. I mean, the whole fight is a great story here, the fight between the Washington Post thing about 3 or 4 weeks ago, did a good inside thing. It's the real fight over this between the State Department and the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense wants to localize it and turn over the fighting war to the local. The State Department wants to build up the national central power. They're fighting to this very minute on what they're doing, and they have no solution for it.
Yeah, look, at this point, it's only anecdotal, but my sense, just talking with senior people in the Army and the Marines, is that they are not happy campers. They don't think that this is a project that they're likely to be able to use their magnificent abilities to accomplish much. And I had one 4-star who I'd written a series of columns last fall, basically elaborating on what I've just uttered this morning, and saying, keep it up, which sort of surprised me. 4-star Army.
Well, I mean,
well, I was just going to say, I don't know that I would break down the defense versus state positions quite that way, just based on a read of the top brass, who seem deeply committed to the whole notions of counterinsurgency, i.e. nation building. I think that there is a messianic zeal on the part of people as far as his statements go, including General McChrystal, including many of the top command. You read about, you actually hear the words hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds coming out of 1-star generals. They seem very much committed to this notion of nation building, to this notion of rules of engagement that put our troops at risk. General McChrystal, I don't know how many times he has made the case that it is much more important to protect the Afghan people than our own troops. In orders, in interviews, I mean, this has been a constant refrain. The emphasis on eliminating all civilian casualties as though that will change the Afghan attitudes toward our presence. These kinds of ideas, I think, have deeply, to my mind, twisted the United States military, and I think they're the ideas that have saturated at the very highest levels of command, and I think that is one of our big problems.
You talk about those rules of engagement, and I understand, I agree with you, and I disagree. I don't think we're going to win hearts and minds by killing a few less people inadvertently. But I understand the theory that he's arguing. It may be wrong, but I understand why he's making it. But it is a truly repulsive instruction to give to your troops. And if you know young men and some young women in the line, to tell them, as they now have to do, they have to wait until they're shot at, that if the sniper is in a building where there are civilians, you've got to wait and see if you get killed first before you get to fire. To ask our troops to go into circumstances like that, even if that strategy somehow makes sense, I don't know how we tell our young men to do that. And if you've got a son or if you've got friends, or you meet these young guys and young women now, and they're so willing to do their duty for the country, and then you tell them go in there and be shot because our strategy is we're trying to convince the people who don't want us there that we're not so bad. I mean, it's
a disgrace.
It is.
But the problem is there's two different levels of this. I mean, at the level of strategy, what they're supposed to be doing, the military is very clear. Statements from men here, which I can't quote, but the military doesn't want to do this. But once the military is thrown into doing it, they have no choice except to follow that and to use that terminology. But that isn't what they want to do. Army generals kill people. That's their job, not to do this. But once they're put into that situation and are forced to do it, they have to do it.
The defense and security element of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan flows from the president's determining our vital national interests there. And this is remarkably bipartisan from this president and the previous president. They both clearly outlined what they believe are our vital national interests, not our important or nice to have national interests, that it's critical to the protection and safety of the American people for a variety of reasons, including terrorism, launching of attacks, regional security, Pakistan's stability, et cetera. So the security piece really flows from foreign policy debates, and so we can disagree over the foreign policy angle here, but not necessarily.
What is the vital interest that the current president of the United States sees there that can be resolved within 18 months of us going in? The surge.
Well, or I will add, what does the former president, look, by not putting any troops in there to do anything?
Because this is the one who's carrying our policy right now. I mean, what?
It's schizophrenic. That's exactly. I can't defend the timetable. I truly cannot.
I mean, you can't have a vital interest with an exit strategy that's going to be completed in 18 months. That's the whole point. If you have a vital interest, it's vital, which means all the resources must be applied to keep it. So when he says publicly that, and I'm told our generals believe that's one of the reasons that some of their strategies, they're trying to get as much done as they can as quickly as possible because they know that they're going to be pulled out. That's inconsistent with the whole concept of a vital strategy. I don't know how you can say we have a continuity of vital strategic interest when we have a president who says we're getting out in 18 months.
But we also have a Secretary of Defense that said very clearly, well, we're not really only there for 18 months.
They have walked it back.
He says I mean, the day that the president announces that, the same day the Secretary of Defense was on the Hill saying that it's a flexible date.
And the next day, the president's press secretary was asked, which is it? And he went to the president and came back and said the president still intends that 18 months is a real time. So they're maintaining at best a strategic ambiguity as to our strategy.
How much of this is sort of a bait and switch? I mean, we have the president coming out and saying that we want to implement counterinsurgency, but I'm sure as you're all familiar with the U.S. Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual, M-324, essentially you're going to have to commit large numbers of troops, possibly 200,000 in the South alone, for 12 to 14 years. You have to have enormous political will in the homeland. So, I mean, how much of this, again, I mean, are we really committed to it? Are we just paying lip service to the counterinsurgency doctrine?
It's not even lip service. The number of troops required are more than we're slated to try to induce. Even
it requires more troops
out of the Afghani army, which, by the way, is a force that, although these are the most natural fighters in the world, when they're made into a national army, they refuse to fight. I mean, they fight as tribal men, but they don't fight under Kabul's direction. So we've managed to turn one of the greatest fighting people in the world into shirkers.
And we're resourcing this. I would argue the president is resourcing this with the Goldilocks option. He chose the middle road for the McChrystal report, the extended one. He presented 3 scenarios, and to achieve the maximum chance of success, he didn't choose that option. Why wouldn't you? If it is, and I agree with your
Goldilocks was a fairy tale, as is the strategy.
Well, I mean, we all know that it requires many, many, many more troops than we can even commit.
And time, as you mentioned, absolutely.
So, do you actually? I guess we all disagree with the notion that we'll be out. We'll actually be beginning the withdrawal by July 2011.
I don't disagree with that.
Well.
You all disagree with that?
No, agree that President Obama.
I think he'd like to try.
Exactly.
If he possibly can, he's going to try to start withdrawing troops so that he has a claim to make by election cycle that he has largely honored his job of inheriting 2 wars and ending 2 wars.
So what kind of political criticism do you think that Barack Obama will face from Republicans and conservatives who have historically been against war and nation building? I mean, they've sort of globbed onto this notion that we should be committing more resources and time to this mission.
Well, they've changed their position, unfortunately. The great majority of Republicans are nation builders, in my opinion.
I think the nation building will continue past the 18 months deadline.
I think they will be there. Will be there well beyond next year.
Gates, after the walk back, he also went on to Kabul and had a press conference with Karzai and made the same point. And the number of years that they were discussing as far as an American presence, it was absolutely will turn your hair white.
Well,
15 years, and
right, exactly. Another on top of the past 8 that we've already spent. I mean, sort of in keeping with the theme of the conference, President Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural address, said, "quote, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?" Unquote. So given Afghanistan, given we're operating in a culture we barely understand, we have to penetrate linguistic, cultural, and religious barriers, why do so many Republicans and conservatives believe that social engineering will work in Afghanistan when they do not believe it'll work here in the United States?
I asked one of the major conservative editorial page editors that same question 4 or 5 years ago.
Was that me at the time? Or?
No. It could have been you.
Could have been.
I don't understand it. I just don't understand how you can both hold the position that you cannot manage one country, but you can manage the whole world. To me, it's incomprehensible.
I mean, this is taking us to a different conversation than Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. To the broader foreign policy.
I'll probably disagree with some folks, but.
Oh, well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, no, I'm just because I think there's an alternative to being. I mean, there were no imperialists left anymore. No Teddy Roosevelts who actually want an empire. I think most of us who are more aggressive, who think we need to be engaged in the world, are empiricists. We think there may be factual situations where we protect our interests by being engaged in the world. I certainly am. I think that often we have to be engaged in the world. But then the test is, and that's where we get back to the question, is can we do it in any particular instance? If we can't do it, then it doesn't matter that theoretically we ought to. And I think ideologues, and we have a few neoconservative friends who, as a matter of principle, think we ought to. I mean, there's a famous Weekly Standard cover in favor of reinstating colonies, American colonies. I think that was sort of being, outre a little bit. I don't think Crystal really meant that. But there's other than that wing that thinks that sort of American greatness requires us as part of our spirit to be out there dominating the world. I think most of us who would be seen as internationalists, as engagers, as I think of myself, only do it because we think in a particular instance there's something that needs to be done that we're capable of doing. And then it's a factual discussion. I mean, Pat Buchanan and I have been arguing these foreign policy issues for 15 years. And I don't think there's an ideological difference between us, although we never agree on a single thing, because he always sees that America's interest is more likely to be guaranteed by us staying home. And I tend to see our interest likely to be increased by, take Israel. I mean, if we want to get into that question. Is Israel a burden, as General Petraeus is now arguing, that Israel's refusal to surrender her sovereignty to the surrounding Arabs is undercutting our troops' ability to fight in the Muslim world, which is an interesting proposition that Petraeus made, if the news reports are right. Or is Israel, for a lot of reasons, an ally worth protecting? And it's a factual question. That second one is a factual question. Either they are or they aren't. I think they are, although I can conceive the argument that they're not. But that's the difference between an ideology of greatness abroad and just trying to figure out the facts, what helps and what doesn't.
Well, I think that maybe they're both ideological both ideological answers that you're getting at. If I would argue that Petraeus' recent remarks, which I believe have been confirmed in his own testimony before the Senate, I believe yesterday, which essentially restated what had been reported, which was, if you haven't heard about it, he basically was supposed to have sent staff officers to brief the Joint Chiefs Chairman Mullen, et cetera, on the position of his Arab leaders in his CENTCOM sphere, on the fact that the Arab leaders are very frustrated by Israeli intransigence and that this was undercutting American interests. We saw this amplified by Vice President Biden in Israel, reported to have said, with the housing crisis, that the houses in Jerusalem were now endangering American troops in various theaters. So it becomes actually a very important part of this. I would argue that that is actually the Arabist way of looking at the world, the Islamic way of looking at the world, the Ummah-centric way of looking at the world, whereas conceiving of Israel as an ally, going to the other side of the aisle, would be the Western anti-jihad point of view. So I think they both fall within two ideologies. The question becomes, which one do we follow? And I think that's kind of where we are. I think it's a question that's never asked because we do never discuss the Islamic nature. I mean, so far in our discussion of Afghanistan, we haven't really even touched on the Islamic nature of the culture, which I believe is at root, putting up obstacles to a lot of our attempts to impose Western frameworks on the way they live and govern themselves or not govern themselves.
Well, in what respects do you feel that U.S. interventions, both throughout the Cold War and then after the end of the Cold War, now through the War on Terror, how much do you think that U.S. intervention abroad actually incites violence against the United States? I remember we saw this during one of the Republican primary debates in 2008 between Rudy Giuliani and Ron Paul. And Rudy Giuliani all but demonized Ron Paul for even alleging that the United States was responsible for having the violent acts of 9/11 attributed to it for its interventions abroad. Would you agree with that notion? Where on the continuum would you sit? Would you sit more with Rudy Giuliani or more with Ron Paul, and why?
Oh, well, I would certainly agree more with Rudy Giuliani. I don't believe that a nation defending itself or defending its allies or defending its way of life can be accused of incitement, because the alternative way is essentially to submit. And so I think that is a characterization that is a tactical, acts in it anyway as a tactic of tamping down national self-interest.
A little like English intransigents, outraging the Nazis and inflaming their activity.
Very much so. Exactly. I mean, I'm sure that, a counterattack by the United States during World War II, it seriously upset the German populations or the Japanese. It's exactly the same thing. So I think incitement is a funny way to characterize.
But there can be a causal relationship, even if it's not incitement is itself sort of an inflammatory word. But obviously there can be a causal relationship. Our alliance with Israel undoubtedly has exacerbated our problems in the Middle East. That is an undeniable fact. Now it may be offset by other interests that we judge. I think that they are. But to ignore the fact that as one tool that recruiters use, the Israeli example in its occupation or its governance of the West Bank is a factor, is true. But then you get to the more difficult question of whether it's in the nature of Islam to be expansionist and aggressive or not, and that becomes a very ideological and sensitive question. In other words, was the period of militant Islam purely a state, like militant Christianity in the Middle Ages, or is something inherent in the religion, which means that you can't satisfy it. You have to submit, either submit or not. And that's a debate that is maybe a theological one, but it also has a very practical foreign policy consequence.
But it is an empirical question.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think it should be considered delicate.
It's not theological at all. It's
like
empirical.
It's something we can't talk
Are
about.
they or aren't they inherently aggressive? I agree with you that the issue is the national interest and how you define it, and it's not ideological. There are people, the neoconservatives on one side and the Wilsonian intervention on the other. They're ideological. The problem with conservatism, as I understand it, and it goes back to the first statement, the Sharon statement of the modern conservative movement, what's in the just interest of the United States? It's the only justification for being involved in it. But what that is empirically can have enormously large different empirical. Mm-hmm. You talk about Buchanan. One of my best friends, I gave him one of his first jobs, is John Bolton. He says, I'm always for national interest. It depends. But we never agree what's in the national interest, but at least it's the right criterion. And then we get down to deciding, is it or isn't it in our national interest? And we try to do it on as empirical as possible grounds.
If you put your money where your mouth is, though, and you look at not just our words, and in this case, I'd argue in Afghanistan, Tony raises a great point. We're not actually resourcing what is supposedly a vital national interest. But since the end of World War II, America's global leadership role has largely been unchanged by treaty or interest around the world by a president of either political party, which by extension means our vital national security interests have been largely unchanged in the past 50, 60 years. If you look around the world beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. forces are engaged in over 80 countries today. That's remarkable. Now, that leads to things like we're the world's policeman, et cetera. But what I want to know is then if we disagree on sort of what our role is in the world, then why isn't it changing? You know, no president of either party, including this one, is diminishing those commitments anywhere.
Right. No one ever questions the presumption of U.S. primacy in the world. We're talking about the possible inherent expansionist tendencies of Islam, but what about the inherent expanded tendencies of the United States? I mean, as you say, not only do we have military operations in 80 different countries, we have U.S. forces stationed in 148 different countries and 11 territories.
The question that they're there, but are they used? Now, look, Ronald Reagan committed U.S. forces less than any president of modern time other than Jimmy Carter, all right? That's not a mistake. I mean, he has a sense of power, should be absolutely the last choice. Remember, when he went to the arms control agreement, what happened in the conservative community? They called him, forgetting the word, but a sellout to the Soviet Union, one of the leaders of the major conservative groups. Now, that's an ideological anti-communism as opposed to an empirical one based on interest. The Sharon Statement, by the way, again, says that anti-communism is, quote, at present, the danger because it is a threat to these liberties of the United States. It should be an empirical question. And having them stationed around the world, which we can question, is different than whether you're easily willing to use them or not. And Ronald Reagan was not. And he's my guide.
I guess I got to, for me at least, I'm not sure that there is, I don't know what we mean by conservative foreign policy. We have, on domestic policy, a spectrum between libertarianism and statism or authoritarianism. And I know, Reagan was on the libertarian end of that. On foreign policy, you have engagement and non-engagement. You have everyone from Wilson and Roosevelt, who were almost authoritarian, certainly statist domestically, who were engagers. Reagan was an engager, not with any more military force than necessary. So you can be either place on those spectrums. You can be a liberal, you can be a statist at home, and believe in engaging and defending national interests as you see it, or you can be a Ron Paul, and you can have either combination. You can be libertarian and non-engaged, libertarian and engaged, as Reagan was. You can be authoritarian and engaged, as Wilson or Roosevelt, or authoritarian and, I guess, not engaged, which may end up being the current president, perhaps. I don't know. But I don't see why it's conservative to either be engaged or not. I don't know. I know what conservatism is from my point of view. I don't see how it applies to foreign policy.
And part of that gets to the definition of nation building you referenced earlier, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with social engineering as part of that. But nation building alone and the definition of nation building versus state building, I think gets to, I agree there is no conservative foreign policy, but particularly conservatives on this notion and mission of nation building is largely disagreement as well. There's no unified answer on what that is. Conservatives generally have thought in the past limited humanitarian nation-building missions led by the UN, for example, in Bosnia and Kosovo, are limited and okay in certain scenarios, but these larger, broader scale efforts that may have been described, yes, there's no answer, and none of us necessarily agree.
I think that maybe
I think on nation building, I think there is an ideological. The quote you gave from Reagan, I could give you one from his Guildhall speech that says pretty much the same thing. I mean, he said, if we can't do it here, how can we possibly do it for somebody else? I think that is ideological. If you believe in limited government as how you, for us and anyone else who could possibly do it, you can't believe you can run somebody else.
Well, let me ask you, what would you think Reagan would have done if, with the frame of mind he had in the 1980s, he'd had in 1945, would he have been in favor of nation building in Japan and Germany? Roosevelt was, but then he believed in, social nation building inside the country too. So,
well, I mean, I believe if you get in a war, you have to occupy the country and you have to pacify it enough so you can get out safely, all right? Now, how far, you take Germany as a perfect example. We did the worst possible job in Germany you could imagine. We told them every wrong thing to do for their economy. And it wasn't until Adenauer said, General Clay, I'm not going to pay any more attention to you. We're going to take off the controls. We're going to, it wasn't until the local people broke with our good intention idea that we built Germany. It wasn't us that did it. It was Adenauer and Erhard that built Germany correctly. In Japan, all of the leaders over there wanted us there. They wanted us there as a figurehead. We didn't have to go around the country after the couple of months as long, and MacArthur was a genius because he let the emperor stay in control.
But he did guide policy. He set up unions and liberated women, and I mean that was an active engagement.
Well, I think Japan is an interesting example to bring up. Japan was decimated, completely looked like a lunar landscape after it was all over. President Bush often cited Japan and the success of rebuilding Japan for his program in Iraq. Now, a massive difference is, one, the decimation, but also, this is very interesting, and I didn't know this until I read this a couple of years ago. The United States essentially outlawed public Shintoism. Shintoism was the public creed of the Japanese people for some generations. Shintoism bears striking similarities to Islamic jihad doctrine. And the State Department, the American State Department, in conjunction with the military, in conjunction with everyone, agreed that it was essential to take Shintoism out of the public sphere, out of the schools, out of the government, out of the public discussion, and say, yes, it can be your private ideology, you can light your candles and have your shrines, etc. No more public creed. That was enforced very completely, and I think probably is one of the great untold stories or little-known stories about that rebuilding of the country. President Bush was completely erroneous to compare any of those things to what went on in Iraq, which of course was not decimated, and indeed we enshrined Islam in the Constitution that was written in 2004.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean...
It's also a very different kind. It doesn't have its all statement of principles. It's a general kind of agreed upon...
It incited the aggression. It was very much the warrior, aggressive, conquest kind of
but
principles.
that's different than Shintoism.
No, that is Shintoism. That was what the Americans believed was driving Japanese aggression.
Well, excuse me one second. I mean, I understand the whole problem with Islamic Jihad, but Islam did not attack the United States on 9/11. Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11. So unless we're prepared to occupy every single Muslim majority country in the world, then, I mean, what are we talking about when it comes to interests and threats?
In terms of
nation building. But if we're talking about the Al-Qaeda network that has cells in countries, in many countries, I mean, they had cells in Germany, they had cells in the United States, they had cells in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia. To some extent, I mean, are we sort of broadening our number of interests and the number of threats, and are we sort of losing sight when we sort of lump Al-Qaeda together with Islam?
Look, the problem is Al-Qaeda is one aspect of one part of Islam, and the part of Islam that we're concerned about, which is the radical, violent expression. Whether that's innate in Islam or not is a debatable question. If it may be a force that we can't manage, that doesn't mean it's not a force that's threatening. I mean, those are two different analytical points. You know, maybe we can't deal with it, but if in fact we're facing that kind of hostility, you know, around the world, maybe we can't match it. But to say that it doesn't exist because we may not have the resources to match it doesn't seem to me analytically valid.
Well, and to Tony's point earlier as well about mission creep, which is fair, but it also is to your excellent point about the interests versus threats. In Afghanistan, for example, the U.S. military would say that there are 5 different and unique threats. Now, some, of course, share larger goals and objectives, namely Al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership, the big T, not the what I would call the little T, the daily paid, locally engaged who would put down their weapon if something else viable came along. But we also have, of course, those two, which are separate and distinct, but of course the Haqqani network. And you also have the local insurgencies and ordinary crime and regular corruption. And so all of these in Afghanistan, it certainly isn't just one type of threat emanating from al-Qaeda, although that's the primary reason we were there.
I would say that I think that in many ways the most militant expressions of jihad and terrorism are in many ways distractions that have successfully attracted all of our focus. That's what our focus is here today. I think the other aspect of Islam, and I think it's a mistake, in other words, to just focus on al-Qaeda as the sort of brand name or the brand form. To me, the greater threat than actually these wars or getting on airplanes and possibly being blown up, the greater threat is the spread of Islamic law, which can happen quite peacefully through demographic increases. We see it all over Europe, which is one of my great interests. So I think that it is actually quite important to tie all these things together, not to get just tunnel vision on al-Qaeda or Taliban or name your Islamic group that we are fighting in Somalia and Yemen, however many there are. The far greater threat to me, and what I actually see as extinguishing Western-style liberty, is the incursion of Islamic law in the West. So when I opened up with the statement discussing Afghanistan falling to the far side of my line of battle, much more concerns, rather than trying to impose a Western framework on the Islamic world, which is essentially what I think we're doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, and what next in the other countries that seem to be on the list, judging by General Petraeus' testimony. We are ignoring the incursions of Islamic law into the Western sphere.
Yeah, I mean, you make a terribly important point, because is it, for instance, in America's national interest that the concept of freedom of expression should still be cherished in Europe? I've got involved in the last couple of weeks in sort of a urinating contest digitally in Europe because I had said that we should defend whether or not I would have driven a rude cartoon about Muhammad, that we have an obligation to defend the person's right to express that, the Voltaire proposition. And then get a lot of discussion saying that in which very sensible Western people who sort of come out of all the same value sets that we've all been educated in say, no, you need to. Free speech is nice, but it's just, if it's too threatening, then we shouldn't exercise it. Now,
it's incitement.
Yeah, and if that's a value that
how about all the anti-Nazi laws in Europe? Now, come on.
Yeah, I disagree with those too. But I disagree with those.
And look at the social pressures here against go out and give a pro-Nazi speech here, all right? I mean, I understand that, reaction, and I don't think people should do it. Now, having laws against it is a different kind of thing.
Being prosecuted.
But it's a serious kind of statement to make, the same as it would be here. Very insightful.
But the broader question is, does America have a national security interest in the cultural values of Europe? I mean, that's what in this situation. It's not going to be solved by military, one way or the other, but I think that arguably we do. And a foreign policy ought to, in part, try to encourage those values of freedom, which we think we don't want to be the only island on the planet having, because it'll get extinguished here, probably, if the rest of the planet doesn't share the values. Which is why Reagan, and as Dana was talking in the previous, saw that we have some kind of restrained duty to encourage freedom.
I think we do, in the John Quincy Adams. But, if we really want to do something about it, what we really have to do is convince Europeans to have children, right? I mean, it is not going to be a European society very long. You have a 1.2 reproduction rate. It is going to be Muslim someday.
Well, I don't think it's a baby race. I mean, I think that it makes a lot more sense, rather than encouraging children, is to understand that a demographic in favor of Sharia comes about through Islamic immigration.
And on that note, we're going to turn it to the audience for Q&A. Thank you so much.